The morning Abel Watkins drove the first cedar post into the hard, red earth of Burnt Creek Valley, Etta Townsend was watching him from her kitchen window with both hands wrapped around a tin cup of black coffee and an expression on her face that could have curdled fresh milk. It was the spring of 1878, and the valley had just thawed enough to work, and already the trouble was beginning. Etta had come to Burnt Creek 2 years prior, following her late husband Thomas's will and the surveyor's deed that named her rightful owner of the 43 acres adjacent to the Watkins property. Thomas had died of a fever before he ever laid eyes on the land he'd purchased sight unseen from a territorial land agent, leaving Etta at 26 with nothing but a mule named Biscuit, a trunk full of seed catalogs, and a piece of paper that said she owned a corner of something that might, with enough work and enough stubborn will, become something worth living on. She had made it into exactly that. 2 years of breaking ground by hand, of coaxing water from the creek that ran along the eastern edge, of building a small but solid house with timber she traded labor for with the Garza family down in town. Her garden had become something people in Burnt Creek talked about: rows of sweet corn and climbing beans, beds of sage and lavender that scented the whole south end of the valley when the wind came right, sunflowers so tall they swayed above the fence posts like curious neighbors, except there had been no fence posts. Not yet. Not until now. Abel Watkins was 29 years old, broad-shouldered and deliberate in everything he did, the kind of man who measured twice and cut once and measured again just to be certain. He had worked his 60 acres since he was 19, first alongside his father, and then alone after the old man's heart gave out 2 winters ago. He raised cattle and a little wheat and kept to himself with a steadiness that the people of Burnt Creek respected even if they found it a little cold. He was not unfriendly, but he was not warm. He was precise, methodical, the kind of man who, if he decided a property line needed a fence, would build that fence along the property line to the inch. And that was exactly what he was doing. Etta set down her coffee cup and walked out onto her porch. He was maybe 30 yards from her front steps, working with a post hole digger and a surveyor's string he had clearly already run and staked the length of the line. The posts he had in the wagon were raw cedar, straight and clean, and he was sinking them with a quiet, rhythmic efficiency that made her feel, irrationally, like she was being enclosed. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" she called out. Abel Watkins looked up. He had dark eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red rock the valley was named for, and when he looked at her, it was with the expression of a man who had anticipated this conversation and had decided in advance not to be moved by it. "Building a fence," he said. "I can see you are building a fence," Etta said, stepping off the porch. Her boots hit the dirt and she crossed the yard with her skirt catching the spring wind. "What I am asking is why you are building it there." "Because that is where the property line is," he said, and went back to digging. Etta stopped at the edge of what had been, until this morning, simply a stretch of open ground between their 2 operations, unclaimed and unoffending. She looked at the surveyor's string, which was, she had to admit to herself, frighteningly precise. She had a vague memory of the deed description, the metes and bounds language that Thomas had once read aloud to her and that she had not paid close enough attention to, and she felt a slow, cold realization moving through her. "My garden," she said. He paused again. "What about it?" "My garden beds are right there." She pointed to the south-facing beds, the ones she had put in last fall, the ones with the lavender starts and the garlic she had planted in October, and the rose cuttings she had nursed through winter under straw. 3 of those beds are going to be on the other side of your fence." Abel Watkins looked at the beds. He looked at his string. He looked back at her. "Property line is the property line," he said. Etta stared at him for a long moment. The wind picked up and moved the brim of her hat and she reached up and pressed it down. "You," she said in a very quiet and very controlled voice, "are a deeply irritating man." "You are welcome to check the survey yourself," he said. "Harlan Prout did it in March. I have the document in the house." "I do not need your document," she said, even though she did, because she knew he was right, and that was the worst part. She turned and walked back to her house, and she let the screen door close behind her with more force than was strictly necessary. Abel watched her go. He stood with his post-hole digger in his hands for a moment, looking at the lavender beds and the garlic rows that were just beginning to push green through the red soil. He thought about saying something. He was not sure what. He turned back to his work. By the time the sun went down that evening, he had sunk 18 posts and strung the first wire along the full length of the shared property line. It was a good fence, level and true. He stood back and looked at it in the last orange light of the day, and felt the satisfaction of a thing done correctly. He also felt something else, something he did not have a word for, and he put his tools in the wagon and drove back to his barn without examining it too closely. Etta Townsend spent that evening at her kitchen table with Thomas's deed spread open in front of her and a kerosene lamp burning low, and she traced the property description with her fingertip and found that Abel Watkins had built his fence exactly on the property line, not an inch over, and the 3 beds she had planted were indeed on his side of it. She sat with that for a while. Then she got up, put the deed away, made herself another cup of coffee, and began planning. The following morning she was out in her garden before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. She had her basket and her trowel, and she began gently digging up the lavender starts, one by one, and replanting them along the new fence line on her side of the wire. The garlic she left, since garlic once disturbed rarely forgave you. The rose cuttings she moved with great care, talking to them quietly as she worked, the way her grandmother had taught her to talk to plants as though they were animals that needed reassurance. She was aware, as she worked, that Abel's cattle pasture began directly on the other side of the wire, and that his Hereford cows were watching her from a distance with their large, incurious faces, and she found herself wondering if he ever talked to them. She suspected he did not. She worked until mid-morning, and when she stood up and straightened her back and looked at what she had done, she felt a complicated satisfaction. Her garden now pressed right up against the fence. The lavender would grow through the lower wires. The climbing beans she intended to plant next week would use the fence posts as support, reaching upward on his cedar. She hadn't asked permission, and she wasn't going to. The fence might be his, but the wire was a boundary, and the space right up to it was still hers. She heard boots in the grass behind her and turned to find Abel Watkins standing at the gate of her yard, hat in hand, looking at what she was doing. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. He looked at the lavender starts along the fence line. He looked at the way the garden beds now ran right up to the wire, pressing close, leaning toward it like the fence was the most interesting thing in the whole valley. "I wanted to come say," he said, and then stopped, which was unusual for a man who seemed to operate from a prepared script. "I wanted to say that I am sorry about the beds. I should have said something to you before I started." Etta looked at him. He was turning his hat slowly in his hands, which she suspected was the equivalent of great emotional turmoil in a man like Abel Watkins. "Yes," she said, "you should have." "I can move the fence 2 feet west," he said. "It would not be on the line, but it would give you back your beds." She considered this for a moment, genuinely surprised. "And your survey document?" "Would be 2 feet from accurate," he said, with the tone of a man agreeing to something that caused him physical pain. Etta looked at the fence. She looked at her beds, which were already replanted and already beginning to look like they belonged where they were. She looked at Abel Watkins, who was clearly a man for whom 2 feet from accurate was a genuine sacrifice. "Keep your fence where it is," she said. "I have already moved the beds." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite relief, not quite surprise, something between them. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He put his hat back on and turned to go, and then he stopped. "That lavender will come through the wire," he said, "and onto my side." "I know it will," Etta said pleasantly. He stood there for a moment as if he wanted to say something about that, and then he apparently decided against it, and he walked back through the gate and across the line to his own land. Etta watched him go and then turned back to her garden and began humming to herself. The spring moved on the way springs do in the high country of the New Mexico Territory, which is to say it moved fast and warm and then suddenly brutal, with late frosts that dropped out of nowhere in the night and turned everything fragile to black in the morning. Etta lost half her bean seedlings to one such frost in late April and spent the better part of a morning replanting from her second tray of starts, kneeling in the cold, wet soil with her jaw set and her hands red. She heard the gate and looked up to find Abel Watkins standing there with something in his arms. "I had extra blanket cloth," he said, holding out a folded stack of old canvas. "From the barn. If you lay it over the beds tonight, it'll hold enough warmth." Etta sat back on her heels and looked at him. "There is another frost coming Thursday," he said, as if clarifying. "How do you know that?" "The cattle were restless yesterday evening. They always know." She took the canvas from him. It smelled like hay and cedar and something clean and outdoors that she couldn't name. "Thank you," she said, and meant it without qualification, which was a new experience with this particular man. "They do not all need replanting," he said, nodding at the beds. "The second row looks like it held." She turned to look. He was right. The second row of beans, which had been under a heavier mulch layer, had come through without damage. She had been so focused on the loss that she had not noticed the survival. "You have a good eye," she said. "I have been watching," he said, and then seemed to realize how that sounded and cleared his throat. "The garden. I can see it from the pasture when I check the fence line." "I know you can," she said, without any particular inflection. He nodded once and walked back through the gate. She spread the canvas over the beds that afternoon, weighting it with stones at the corners, and Thursday night a hard frost came down from the north and killed the young corn across half the valley. Her beans survived. When she pulled back the canvas on Friday morning and found them green and unbroken, she felt a rush of gratitude that surprised her with its force. The summer of 1878 was long and dry and bright, and Burnt Creek Valley settled into its own rhythm of work and heat and the occasional drama of town life. The valley had 3 families, one trading post run by a man named Caldwell who also served as the closest thing to a postmaster they had, a blacksmith shop, and a church that got a circuit preacher 4 times a year. The nearest actual town was Mesilla, which was a half-day's ride south, and most people made that trip only when they had to. Etta went to Mesilla in late June to sell the first of her lavender and her dried herbs at the market there, and she came back with enough money to buy a second mule and a new hoe, and a bolt of blue cotton cloth she had been thinking about for weeks. She also came back with news, which she stopped at the trading post to share because that was how things worked in the valley. "There is going to be a surveyor general coming through the county this summer," she told old Caldwell, who was half-deaf and nodded at everything. "Something about resettling property disputes. The railroad is looking at a route through the lower valley." Caldwell nodded. "If they put a railroad through the lower valley, it will change everything," she said. Caldwell nodded again. She bought her mail and rode home. What Etta had not said at the trading post, because she had not yet fully worked it out herself, was that if the railroad came through the lower valley, it would almost certainly run through the creekside section of her property, which was the section she had not yet developed but intended to, and that the territorial government's approach to such things was not always favorable to individual landowners, particularly female landowners who could not vote and whose legal standing in property disputes was, to put it kindly, inconsistent. She sat on her porch that evening and thought about it until the stars came out. The next morning she walked to the fence line where she was training her climbing beans up the cedar posts, and she looked through the wire at the distant figure of Abel Watkins moving among his cattle in the morning light, and she thought about how the railroad would affect his land too, and whether that was a conversation worth having. She decided it was. She found him at his barn just before noon, mending harness leather in the doorway with the kind of patient, careful stitching that she was beginning to notice, characteristic of everything he did. "I wanted to tell you something I heard in Mesilla," she said. He set the harness down and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. In the full sun of midday she noticed for the first time that there was a small scar at the corner of his jaw, pale and crescent-shaped, and she wondered where it had come from but did not ask. She told him about the railroad survey. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to expect from him, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, turning the implications over in that methodical way he had. "The lower section," he said. "That is Creekside, your best water." "Yes. It is the same for me. My lower pasture is where I winter the young cattle. If they run rail through there, we would both be damaged by it," she said. "Yes." He stood up and walked to the barn door and looked out at the valley, which spread below them in the summer haze, golden and quiet. "There is a land rights attorney in Mesilla, a man named Forsyth. He handled the original Watkins deed when my father first filed." "I know that name," Etta said. "I used a different man for my filing, but I have heard Forsyth is reliable. If both our deeds are presented together, it makes a stronger case against a forced easement," he said. He was looking at the valley and not at her, but she could tell he was choosing his words with care. "Two adjacent properties with established use claims. It is harder to dismiss. You are suggesting we file together." "I am suggesting we speak to Forsyth together," he said. "File separately but present the situation as part of the same argument." Etta considered that. It was a practical suggestion. It was the kind of suggestion a man like Abel Watkins would make, stripped of any sentiment but correct on its merits. "All right," she said. "Next week. I can be ready by Thursday." "Thursday," he agreed. The ride to Mesilla on Thursday was, technically speaking, one of the longest uninterrupted conversations Etta had ever had with Abel Watkins, which was not saying a great deal given that most of their interactions to that point had been conducted across a fence line, with the air of two foreign dignitaries negotiating a treaty. But the road was long, and the heat was manageable, and there was something about the rhythm of horses moving together on a dirt road that loosened things. She learned that he had grown up in the valley, that his mother had died when he was 11, that his father had been a quiet man who had taught him to work without complaint and to respect the land as a thing borrowed rather than owned. She told him about growing up in Virginia, about the small farm her family had worked, about Thomas and his dream of Western land and how she had agreed to it because she had loved him and because she had secretly wanted to see what was past the Blue Ridge Mountains her whole life. "And now you are here," Abel said. "And now I am here," she agreed. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Virginia." She thought about that honestly. "I miss some people," she said. "But no, I do not miss it. I think this is where I belong." He nodded, and something in that nod felt like agreement rather than mere acknowledgement, as if he was confirming something he had already suspected. Forsyth was a short, energetic man with ink-stained fingers and a manner that suggested he found legal battles genuinely enjoyable, which Etta found both alarming and reassuring. He listened to their situation, examined their deeds, and told them with great confidence that a railroad easement claim could absolutely be challenged, particularly if they could demonstrate continuous and productive use of the Creekside land. "Miss Townsend," he said, looking at her over his spectacles, "your garden operation is documented how?" "I sell at the Mesilla market," she said. "Caldwell at the trading post has bought from me as well. I have records." "Good. Watkins, your winter pasture use." "I have tallied head count by season since my father's time," Abel said. "Better than good." Forsyth leaned back in his chair. "Here is what you will do. You will each file a formal declaration of use with the county recorder. You will present those declarations as parallel documents. The railroad surveyor general will have to address them both. Individually, each of you is a widow woman and a bachelor farmer with a lot of land and not a lot of legal clout. Together, you are an established agricultural operation that predates the railroad's interest in the valley by decades." Etta noticed he had said widow woman with a kind of dismissive matter-of-factness that made her teeth ache, but she also noticed that his strategy was sound and that he was, in his way, fighting for her, so she let it go. They filed the declarations that afternoon and rode back to the valley in the long evening light. "Thank you," she said, when they reached the fork where the road divided toward their respective properties. "It benefits us both," he said, which was true and was also not quite an answer to what she had said. She looked at him in the copper evening light, this quiet, precise, unexpectedly decent man, and she said, "I know it does. I'm still grateful." He held her gaze for a moment, and in that moment she saw something in his face that was not the usual controlled neutrality but something less guarded, something that looked almost like warmth. "So am I," he said, and turned his horse toward home. The railroad survey came through in August. Two men with equipment and notebooks who spent 3 days measuring and noting, and who spoke to Etta and Abel on separate occasions, but whose questions made clear that Forsyth's preparations had been received. By September, word came back through Caldwell's trading post that the proposed route had been adjusted, running the rail line through the flat land further east, away from the creek properties. Etta was in her garden when she heard, pulling the last of the summer beans, and she stood up and pressed a hand to her heart and let out a long breath. That evening she made a pie with the last of the summer peaches she had been saving, wrapped it in a cloth, and walked it over to Abel Watkins's door. He answered in his shirt sleeves without his hat, and she had the disorienting experience of realizing he was, in the ordinary late-evening domesticity of his own doorway, quite startlingly handsome. She had known this in the abstract. She had not, until this moment, felt it land. She held out the pie. He looked at it and then at her. "To celebrate," she said, "the railroad." He took the pie carefully, both hands, like something worth being careful with. "You made this." "I did." "Thank you, Etta," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it came out in a voice that was quieter than his usual register, something in it that made the evening air feel warmer. "Good night, Abel," she said, and walked back across the line between their properties in the dark. She was smiling when she got inside, and she did not examine that too closely either. Autumn in Burnt Creek Valley had a particular quality of golden, dry abundance, the kind that made the work of harvest feel like a celebration even when your back was aching and the days were shortening fast. Etta had a good season. The lavender had gone to Mesilla in 3 separate loads, the herbs had sold out at Caldwell's, and the corn, replanted after the spring frost, had come in thick and sweet, and she had put up more dried cobs and ground meal than she could use in 2 winters. She was building her cold storage, deepening the cellar below her kitchen, which was hard, solitary work, and she was 3 feet down on a Tuesday afternoon when she heard the gate and looked up from the hole to find Abel Watkins standing over her. "What are you doing?" he said. "Digging a cellar," she said. "What does it look like?" "It looks like the walls are going to collapse," he said, looking at the sandy sides of the excavation with an expression of professional concern. "You have not shored the sides." "I was going to get to that." "You were going to be buried alive first," he said, and climbed down into the hole beside her with a complete absence of drama that somehow made the whole thing more alarming. He put his hands on the walls, feeling the composition of the soil, pressing, testing. "You need to cut the angle back another foot on each side before you go deeper," he said, "and timber the corners. Do you have lumber?" "I have some," she said, because she was standing in a hole with him and he was right and there was no point in being defensive about it. They worked together until the sun went down. He showed her the angle and helped her cut it, and then they laid the timber corners together, and she found that working beside him was easy in a way she had not anticipated. He did not take over. He did not explain things she already knew. He asked what she wanted and then he helped her get it. When the light got too thin to work safely, he climbed out and she climbed out after him, and they stood in her yard covered in red dirt, and she caught him almost smiling at the sight of them both. "What?" she said. "You have dirt on your nose," he said. She reached up and rubbed it. "Better." "No," he said, and that time the smile came just barely, just the corner of his mouth, but it was there and it changed his whole face, and she felt it like something warm pressing against her sternum. She made coffee and they sat on her porch steps, because neither of them was clean enough to go inside. And the stars came out above the valley one by one, and they talked about the coming winter and the price of cattle and the state of the road to Mesilla. And eventually, the silence between them became comfortable instead of awkward, which was a thing she had not known could happen this quickly. "My father used to say that a neighbor who builds you a better fence is worth more than one who leaves the gate open," Abel said, eventually, looking at the stars. "Your father sounds like a complicated man," Etta said. He was quiet for a moment. "He was a good man," he said. "He just did not always say things in ways that were easy to take warmth from." "And you," she said, "do you say things in ways that are easy to take warmth from?" He turned to look at her, and the porch lamp threw its light across his face, and she could see him considering the question with the same seriousness he brought to everything. "I am trying to learn," he said. Etta looked at him for a moment and then looked back at the stars. "I think you are better at it than you believe," she said. The night closed around them, full of cricket's song and the distant lowing of his cattle, and neither of them moved for a long time. October came, and with it the first cold and the last color, the cottonwoods along the creek going yellow and then gold and then bare in a span of 3 weeks that always seemed too fast. Etta was cutting back her garden beds for winter when she noticed that the lavender she had planted along the fence had, as she had predicted, grown through the lower wires and was spreading onto Abel's side. A good thick fringe of it, silver green and fragrant even in the dry autumn air. She was considering it, half smiling, when she heard him at the fence. He was standing on his side, looking down at the lavender that had crossed the line. "I told you it would come through," she said. "You did," he agreed. He crouched down and touched one of the stems carefully, with the same careful deliberateness he brought to harness leather and fence posts and everything else. "It smells like something," he said. "Lavender generally does," she said. "I know it is lavender," he said, with a slight exasperation that she found charming. "I mean, it smells like, I do not know how to say this." "Like summer staying past its welcome," she offered. He looked up at her. "Yes," he said, "like that." She looked at him crouching in the dry grass with his hand on the stem of her lavender, this methodical, precise, unexpectedly tender man, and she felt something she had been feeling for weeks finally arrive fully and declare itself. She was in love with Abel Watkins. The recognition did not frighten her. She had been in love before. She had loved Thomas, genuinely and without reservation, and she had grieved him genuinely and without reservation. And she had come out the other side of that grief into this valley and this life, and she understood now that love was not a finite resource that spent itself with use, but something that renewed like the garden if you were willing to tend it. She did not say any of this. She said, "You can leave it. If it grows on your side, it grows. I do not mind." "Neither do I," he said, and stood up, and looked at her across the fence with something in his face that she thought, with a flutter of something fine and nervous in her chest, might be the same recognition she had just arrived at herself. Winter settled in hard in November, the way it did in the high country, with cold that came not dramatically but steadily, like a long deliberate argument. Etta's cellar was finished and packed with jars and dried goods. Her wood was split and stacked. She had a good wool coat and enough kerosene, and she was, by the honest assessment of anyone who knew her, well prepared. That did not stop Abel Watkins from checking on her. It started practically. He brought over an extra load of firewood in mid-November because he had cut more than he needed and it would go to waste, he said. He stopped by one evening to report that there was ice on the creek and she ought not to water from it until it thawed. He mentioned, in passing, that the trail to Mesilla could drift to impassable in a bad snow, and she should do her town business before Christmas if she had any. All of it was practical. All of it was neighborly. And yet there was something in the frequency of his appearances, in the way he always seemed to find a reason, that made Etta feel watched over in a way that was not surveillance but something gentler. One December evening, he appeared at her door with a brace of rabbits he had taken that afternoon, and she invited him in for the first time properly. and cooked them with dried sage from her stores, and they ate at her kitchen table in the lamplight with the wind moving around the house outside, and the conversation moved from practical to something else entirely. He told her about his plans for the spring, a new cattle barn he wanted to build in the lower pasture, a variety of winter wheat he had been reading about that was better suited to the valley soil. She told him about the seed orders she had placed in Mesilla, the new herbs she intended to try, the section of creekside land she wanted to put under cultivation next summer if the soil proved workable. "The soil there is good," he said, "sandy but deep, with enough organic matter it will hold water." "I was thinking the same thing," she said. He looked at her across the table. The lamp made warm shadows. "You have changed things," he said. "What things?" "Here," he said. "The valley, it was quiet before. Not bad quiet, just settled. And then you came and you built something alive. And now when I look south from the pasture, I see your garden, and it looks like the valley is growing toward the sun." Etta was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved and the house creaked and held. "That might be the loveliest thing anyone has ever said to me," she said softly. He looked startled by that, as if he had not quite meant to say it or had not expected it to land that way. He looked down at his plate and then back up at her, and she saw the struggle in his face. The man who did not know how to say things in ways that were easy to take warmth from, working very hard to become something different. "I mean it," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That is why it is lovely." Later, when he was standing at her door with his coat and hat, ready to step out into the cold, he turned back once. "Etta," he said. "Abel," she said. He stood there for a moment, working up to something, and she waited. "I find that I am glad you are here," he said. "I have been glad since before the fence. I wanted you to know that." She reached out and put her hand briefly on his forearm, just below the wool of his coat, and she felt him go very still under her touch. "I am glad too," she said. He went out into the cold night, and she stood at the window and watched the lamp of his lantern move across the dark until it disappeared through his barn door, and she put a hand to her heart and held it there. Christmas in Burnt Creek Valley was a quiet affair by any standard, but Caldwell put up a tree in the trading post, and the Garza family held a posada that the whole valley attended, and the circuit preacher came through on December 23rd and held a service in the little church that left Etta feeling clean and quietly hopeful in a way that good services sometimes did. Abel sat 2 rows behind her at the service. She did not look back. She did not need to. On Christmas morning, she found a small package on her porch step, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of twine. Inside was a glass jar of honey from the Garza bees, which she had mentioned once, months ago, that she had been wanting to try for a new urban-fused preparation, and a dried sprig of the lavender from his side of the fence, tied with the same twine. She stood on her porch in the cold Christmas morning with the jar in one hand and the lavender in the other, and she laughed out loud, a full bright sound that startled the birds from the cottonwood by the creek. She went inside and made a small package of her own, dried herbs wrapped in the blue cotton cloth she had bought in Mesilla, and walked it over to his house and left it on his porch step. When she came back across the line, her footprints in the thin snow made a path between their 2 homes, and she stopped and looked at that path for a moment before going inside. The new year came, and with it February, which in the valley was the month that tested commitment. The cold was sustained and gray, and the work was maintenance rather than growth. The constant checking of stock, firewood, provisions, the waiting for the first sign of spring. It was the month when people in isolated homesteads sometimes talked themselves into despair. Etta did not despair, but she was lonely, and she was not ashamed to admit that to herself, sitting by her stove on a gray February afternoon with a book she could not concentrate on. She had spent 2 winters relatively alone in this valley, and the first had been about survival and the second had been about building. And now in this 3rd winter there was not survival or building to occupy her, just the waiting, and she was aware for the first time of the large quiet of the house around her. There was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Abel Watkins with snow on his hat and the collar of his coat turned up, holding a chess board. She looked at it. "My father taught me," he said. "Do you know it?" "My uncle taught me," she said. "I have not played in years." "Neither have I," he said. She stepped back from the door to let him in. They played chess by the stove on Tuesday and Thursday evenings through the rest of February and into March. And it was the best winter Etta could remember. Not because of the chess itself, which was a perfectly fine game, but because of the 2 hours twice a week of sitting across a small table from a man who was slowly, carefully, with the same deliberateness he brought to fence posts and harness stitching, learning to be open. He told her about the winter his father had died, the strange mix of grief and responsibility that had left him feeling like a man who had swallowed a stone and was carrying it quietly. He told her about a trip he had made to Santa Fe once, years ago, that had made him understand the scale of the world in a way that had never entirely left him. She told him about Thomas, about the good years and the fear she had felt watching him get sick, and the way grief had a geography you had to walk through, not around. He listened to all of it. He never offered more than she wanted and never withheld when she asked. And over those Tuesday and Thursday evenings, she came to know him in the way you know a landscape when you have walked it in every season, not just the easy ones. In March the snow broke and the valley thawed, and one morning Etta looked out her kitchen window and saw the first green pushing through the soil along the fence line, and her heart lifted so fast it was almost physical. She was in her garden by 7 o'clock, kneeling in the cold, wet earth, and Abel came to the fence at 1:30 and looked at what she was doing, and she looked up at him from her work, and something passed between them that was not yet words but was larger and more certain than any words that had come before. "I have been thinking," he said. "Have you?" she said. "I have been thinking that I would like to take you to the Garza celebration in April, the spring one. If you would be willing to go with me." She looked at him across the fence line, this serious, quiet, precise man who had built his fence exactly on the property line and had given her back her lavender and had brought a chess board in February and had stood at her door on a cold night and told her he was glad she was there. "I would be willing," she said. His jaw unclenched by about 1 degree, which was the Abel Watkins equivalent of wild relief. "Good," he said. "Good," she said. She went back to her planting, and he stood at the fence for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before he went back to his cattle, and she was smiling into the dirt all morning. The Garza spring celebration was held on the Saturday after Easter, a tradition the family had brought from their people's way of marking the season that had become the valley's most genuine social event: fire and music and food, and the particular loose ease of people who had come through another winter together. Nearly every family for 10 miles came, and there was dancing on the flat ground behind the Garza house, fiddle and guitar, and the children ran wild in the new green grass. Abel arrived at Etta's door at 4 in the afternoon, clean-shaved and in his good dark coat, hat in hand. He had the look of a man who had made a decision and was committed to it, which was, she was coming to understand how he looked when he was nervous. "You look nice," she said honestly. "Thank you," he said. "So do you." She had worn the blue cotton dress she had made from the cloth she bought in Mesilla, with her hair pinned up, and a small bunch of dried lavender tucked into the neckline because it seemed fitting. And when she saw him look at the lavender sprig and something in his expression go soft, she was glad she had done it. They rode to the Garzas together in the long spring evening, and the party was everything a spring party in the valley should be: loud and warm and full of the smell of good food and wood smoke. Maria Garza, who was the matriarch of the family and the most observant woman in the county, took one look at Abel and Etta arriving together and said nothing at all but smiled with her whole face. They ate at the long table and talked with neighbors, and Abel, who she had only ever seen in work settings, turned out to be quietly funny in a social situation in the way of people whose sense of humor is dry and comes infrequently, and is therefore more valuable when it appears. He made old Caldwell laugh so hard the man dropped his tortilla, and he talked cattle with the Ray's brothers with the ease of a man in his element, and all the while he stayed close to Etta, not hovering, not possessive, but present, available, turned toward her in the way a plant turns toward the light. When the dancing started, he offered her his hand. "I should tell you I am not a graceful dancer," he said. "I do not need graceful," she said, and took his hand. He was not graceful. He was earnest and careful, and he kept time well, and he held her with the same precise care he brought to everything he valued. And when the fiddle slowed into something longer and she was close to him in the firelight with his hand warm at her back, she looked up at him and he looked down at her, and the distance between them was nothing, was a breath, was a question being asked. "Etta," he said, quietly enough that no one else could hear. "Abel," she said, just as quietly. "I think I have been moving toward this since the morning you came out on your porch and called me a deeply irritating man," he said. She laughed, a real full laugh, and he smiled, the real full smile that she had been seeing more of these last months, the one that changed his face entirely. "You were deeply irritating," she said. "I know it," he said. "I was hoping you had forgiven me." "I forgave you when you brought the canvas for the frost," she said. His hand tightened slightly at her back. "That was April." "It was April," she agreed. "And now it is April again," he said. "It is." He looked at her for a long moment in the firelight, the fiddle moving around them, the stars overhead in the deep blue spring sky, and she waited with the patience of someone who has learned that the best things come in their own time, not rushed. "I love you," he said, with the simplicity of a man who has thought about it for a long time and decided that simple was the right register. Etta felt the words settle over her like something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while." "How long a while?" he asked. "Since October," she said. "The lavender through the fence." "That long?" he said, with something almost wondering in his voice. "I was waiting for you to find your way to it," she said. He shook his head slowly, looking at her with something that was both gratitude and something a little like disbelief. "You are the most patient woman I have ever known," he said. "I am a gardener," she said. "We learn to wait." He laughed at that truly, and the sound of it was one of the finest things she had ever heard. And she put her hand up to his jaw, the jaw with the small crescent scar, and he leaned his cheek into her hand, and they stood there in the middle of the dancing and let the moment be as large as it was. The spring of 1879 was the most beautiful Etta could remember, or perhaps it was only that she saw it differently. She was in her garden before sunrise most mornings, which was nothing new, but now Abel often came and stood at the fence while she worked, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching her with that quiet attention that she had once found unnerving and now found indescribably dear. He would stay until the work of his own morning called him away, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they did not, and both were good. The garden was magnificent that year. She had extended the beds all the way along the fence line, so that her garden now bordered his property for its full length on the south side, a living wall of herbs and flowers and climbing things, and she trained the beans and the morning glory up his cedar posts until the fence itself became a trellis, green and blooming, the boundary between their two properties, a thing of persistent, generous abundance. Abel looked at it one morning in late May and said, "I had not anticipated the fence becoming decorative." "Do you mind?" she said. "No," he said. "I find I like it." He brought her things. He was a man who expressed care through action, which she understood and had begun to appreciate with a depth she could not always put into words. A better hoe handle because he had a spare. A length of copper pipe he had acquired in Mesilla that would improve her water flow from the creek. A book of botanical illustrations he had found in Caldwell's back store that he had thought she might like, which she did, enormously, and which she kept on the table by her bed. She brought him things too. Jars of preserved fruit and dried herb bundles, and once, on a day when he had worked late mending the north fence and come home tired and said nothing about it, a plate of cornbread that she left warm on his porch step without knocking, so that when he came inside he would find it and know that someone had noticed. He came to her door that evening. "The cornbread," he said. "You look tired," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You saw me from the garden." "I can see the north fence from the far corner of the sunflower bed," she said. He reached up and brushed her face with the backs of his fingers, so gently it was barely there, and she turned her cheek into it the way he had turned his cheek into her hand at the Garza party. "Marry me," he said. She had known it was coming, not because she was presumptuous but because she had learned to read him, and when things were becoming certain to Abel Watkins, you could see the certainty settling into his posture like the completion of something structural. "Yes," she said. No qualification, no delay, just yes. He exhaled, slow and long, and she realized he had been holding that breath for a while. "I want to give you the fence line," he said. She blinked. "What?" "The property line. I want to file a formal adjustment with the county. Give you the 2 feet, so your garden is on your side." She stared at him. "Abel, you built that fence exactly on the property line." "I know I did," he said, and that almost smile was fully present now. "And now I want to give you the 2 feet I should have offered last spring." "If we are getting married, it will all be one property anyway," she said. "It will," he agreed. "But I want you to have it. The bed should be yours without question." She put both hands on his face, this wonderful, precise, honorable man, and she kissed him for the first time, standing on her porch with the May evening air soft and warm around them, and the scent of the lavender coming through the fence on the evening breeze. He kissed her back with the same care he brought to everything he valued, which was a great deal of care, and when they finally stepped apart, he was looking at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded in a way she had not seen before, open and full and without any of the careful control, and she thought she could look at him like that for the rest of her life and not tire of it. "Good," she said. "Good," he said. They were married in June, a Saturday, at the little church in the valley. The circuit preacher was persuaded to advance his schedule, and the whole valley came, all 3 families and the Garzas and old Caldwell, who cried with the unself-conscious openness of the hard of hearing, who sometimes forget that other people can see them. Maria Garza brought tamales and 3 kinds of cake and strung paper flowers around the church door, and the day was hot and bright and full of the kind of happiness that is genuine, because it has been earned. Abel stood at the front of the church with his good dark coat and his hat in his hands, and when Etta came through the door in the white muslin dress she had spent 3 weeks making, he watched her walk the aisle with an expression that made Maria Garza press a hand to her own heart. The vows were the traditional ones, the circuit preacher's steady voice filling the little church, and when he came to the part about "for as long as you both shall live," Etta felt Abel's hand tighten on hers, not with anxiety but with certainty, the grip of a man who has measured twice and is sure of the thing he is building. "I do," he said, in a voice that was quiet and absolute. "I do," she said, in a voice that was warm and clear and meant every word. They had a supper at the Garza place afterward, because Maria Garza had essentially demanded it, and there was dancing and too much food, and the sky went from blue to purple to black and filled itself with stars, and Etta danced 3 times with her husband, which she recognized was already one of the finest words she had ever had occasion to use, and each time she said it in her mind, she felt the same pleased flutter. On the ride home in the warm June night, side by side, their horses moving in an easy walk, Abel reached over and took her hand. He held it the whole way back to the valley, and neither of them said anything, and nothing needed to be said. They decided, after some practical discussion, to base themselves at Etta's house, which was smaller but better situated relative to the garden, and to use Abel's house as a working structure, storage for equipment and grain. This arrangement suited both of them and struck the valley as entirely sensible, which it was. Abel moved his personal things across the line on a Sunday morning, 2 trips with the wagon, and when he brought the chessboard and set it on the table by the window where the afternoon light came in, Etta felt something click into place in the house that had been good before and was now complete. Summer bloomed around them in the particular abundance of a year when everything goes right, and the garden was the best it had ever been. With Abel's help with the water pipe, Etta now had reliable irrigation to the eastern beds, and the creekside section she had wanted to develop was planted through July with a long, experimental row of medicinal herbs that she had been reading about in the Botanical Illustrations book and wanted to try. Abel built her a proper drying rack for the herb harvest, cedar framed with linen mesh, 10 feet long, and set it up behind the house in the spot where the afternoon sun was best. He was also expanding the cattle operation, with the new barn he had planned going up through July in the lower pasture, and sometimes Etta would come to the garden in the early morning and hear the sound of his hammer from across the valley, steady and rhythmic, and she would listen to it while she worked and feel the particular piece of a life in which the people you love are nearby and busy at things that matter. They worked hard and they worked together when they could and apart when they had to. And in the evenings they sat on the porch in the last light and talked or didn't talk and ate supper at the kitchen table and played chess by the lamp, and sometimes Abel read aloud from the newspaper he got from Messilla, his voice low and even, while Etta sewed or pressed herbs or simply sat and listened. He was, she discovered, a man who had been lonely for a long time without quite knowing it, who had organized his loneliness into productivity and called it self-sufficiency, and who was now, slowly and visibly, unfurling in the warmth of being known. He laughed more. He talked more. He noticed things he said he had always noticed, but never before had anyone to tell. The way a particular calf had taken to following him, the quality of the light on the ridge at 5 in the morning, a bird he had seen at the creek that he could not identify and spent a week trying to name before Etta found it in the Botanical Illustrations book, where it was also listed by its common name, and he was so genuinely pleased by this that she teased him about it for a week. In September, Etta knew. She had known women who described the first signs of a child with drama or with fear, and she felt neither. She felt something more like recognition, as if she had been waiting for this without being aware of it, the way you wait for a seed you've planted to show itself, patient because you know it is coming, certain of it before you can see the proof. She told Abel on an evening in late September, sitting on the porch in the cooling air, and she watched his face move through surprise and then a complicated, rapid transit of emotion that ended, undeniably, in a joy that was almost too large for the quiet way he showed it. He put his arms around her, both of them carefully, and held her against his chest, and she could feel his heart against her cheek going faster than his calm exterior would have suggested. When, he said into her hair. April, she said, maybe late March. He pulled back to look at her. His eyes were bright. A spring baby, he said. In keeping with everything else, she said, smiling. He laughed and she felt it through his whole chest. Winter came and Etta worked through it at a somewhat reduced pace, which she had to be talked into by both Abel and Maria Garza separately, and in terms she could not argue with. She kept her hand in the planning and the preparation, the seed orders for spring and the expansion she wanted to do on the south beds, and Abel was watchful in the way of a man who is trying not to be seen being watchful, which she found both endearing and mildly exasperating. I am pregnant, she told him, on a day when he had for the third time that week casually appeared beside her while she was doing something entirely manageable. I am not made of glass. I know that, he said. Then stop hovering. I am not hovering, he said. I am standing near you. You are standing near me with concern on your face. He looked at his own expression, which he could not see but which she could describe to him accurately, and the look of a man caught was very briefly there before he recovered it. I worry, he said simply. I know you do, she said, and reached up and touched his face. It is sweet, but I am healthy and strong and the baby is fine. I would tell you if that changed. He held her hand against his cheek. You would tell me, he said. It was not quite a question. I would tell you, she said. He nodded once, the long, slow nod of a man deciding to trust, and went back to his work. He still appeared at her side with convenient regularity, but the concern in his expression modulated over time into something more like steady, warm attention, which she could live with. February was the chess month again, and they played most evenings, and Etta was, it could be noted, a better chess player than Abel, which he had accepted with the equanimity of a man who had decided that certain things were worth swallowing his pride about, particularly when the person beating him was his wife, who he was fairly certain could beat most people at most things if she put her mind to it. "You moved your bishop there deliberately," he said one evening, looking at the board. "I did," she said. "3 moves ago you saw this." "4," she said pleasantly. He looked at her and she looked at him, and he picked up his knight and moved it and shook his head. "Check," she said. He laughed. She loved that laugh. March came in cold and the garden beds were still sleeping under their winter mulch, and on a night in the last week of March, with the first spring wind moving outside and the house warm and full of lamplight, their son was born. Maria Garza, who had been arranged to serve as midwife, and who arrived at dusk with a bag of supplies and the authority of a woman who had delivered half the valley's children, was steady and sure, and exactly what was needed. And Abel sat outside the bedroom door in a chair that he did not remember sitting down in, with his hands clasped and his head bowed. And when he heard the first cry, he rose up from the chair and stood very still for a moment with his eyes shut. Maria came to the door. "A boy," she said. "Your wife is well, you can come." He stood in the doorway of the room, with the lamp making soft light everywhere, and Etta in the bed with the baby in her arms. And she looked up at him with a tiredness that was also somehow a radiance. And he crossed the room and sat beside her and looked at the boy, who was red-faced and remarkable, and who had, he immediately noticed, a quality of focused, furious attention in his expression that reminded him strongly of his wife. "Hello," he said to the baby, in a voice he had never used before, low and careful and full of something he had no word for. The baby looked at him. "He is looking at you," Etta said. "He is," Abel said, with the wondering tone of a man to whom this fact is both obvious and astonishing. "What shall we name him?" she said. They had discussed names but had made no final decision, which Etta had insisted was right, that you should see the child before you name it. Abel looked at the boy for a long time. "Thomas," he said, "if you would like." She looked at him, this man who had thought of that, who had offered that. "Thomas Abel Watkins," she said. "Yes," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they looked at their son in the spring lamplight. Outside, the wind beginning to ease, the valley quiet and cold, and waiting for the season to turn. Thomas Abel Watkins was a solid, serious baby who ate well and slept with conviction, and regarded the world with the focused attention that had been predicted at his first minute of life. He was in the garden with his mother by May, in a basket under the cottonwood at the edge of the yard, while Etta planted her spring beds, and he watched the branches move in the wind with an expression that suggested he was memorizing them. Abel's cattle operation was doing well that spring. The new barn had survived its first winter in good order, and he had expanded the herd by 12 head, and the wheat he had planted in the lower section was coming in green and strong. He hired a young man from Mesilla, a 17-year-old boy named Reuben Garza, one of Maria's grandchildren, to help with the cattle work through the summer, and Reuben was quick and willing and took to the work with an enthusiasm that Abel appreciated. Etta's garden that spring was the fullest and most elaborate it had ever been. She had extended the creekside beds as she had planned, and the medicinal herbs she had tried the previous year had come through and were vigorous. The fence line was a wall of green life again, the lavender thick and sprawling on both sides of the wire, the climbing beans heading up the cedar posts, the morning glory she had added this year opening blue each morning along the entire south length of the property. She was training a new variety of climbing rose she had obtained through the market in Mesilla up the fence posts at the far end, and Abel came to watch her work one afternoon, leaning on the fence with Thomas on his hip, the baby watching Etta with intense interest. "He likes the garden," Abel said. "He is his mother's son," Etta said without looking up from her work. "He has my jaw," Abel said. "He has your jaw and my stubbornness," she said. "You think I am not stubborn," Abel said. "I think you are methodically stubborn," she said. "There is a difference." He considered this. "Is it a flattering difference?" "It is an accurate difference," she said. He looked down at Thomas, who had turned his attention from the garden to the fence wire, which he was examining with one small fist. "Do not," Abel told him. Thomas looked up at him. "I know," Abel said. "It is interesting, but not for hands." Etta watched this exchange from the corner of her eye, and felt a warmth in her chest that she had come to recognize as the specific happiness of watching the man you love with the child you share. That particular compound joy that was its own distinct thing. The summer moved on in its long, bright way, and the days were full and the evenings were good. And in the fall, when the harvest was done and the valley was golden again, and the lavender was putting out its last scent before the cold, Etta sat on the porch with Thomas asleep in his cradle beside her, and looked out at the valley and felt the fullness of it with her whole self. Abel came up the porch steps and sat beside her. He looked at the sleeping baby. He looked at the garden going to its winter sleep, the fence line thick with dried lavender stems. He looked at the valley in the evening light. "I have been thinking," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I would like to take a day and ride to the North Ridge," he said. "There is a section of land there that has been sitting unclaimed since the Hendersons left. It is good timber land. If we acquired it, we could have our own lumber for building. For the expansion you want on the east side of the garden, for whatever else comes." Etta looked at him. "You want to expand." "I want to build toward the future," he said, "whatever that looks like." She thought about that, about the word future and all the things it held in it. The land, the garden, the cattle, Thomas asleep in his cradle, the next spring coming and the one after that. "Let us go to the North Ridge," she said. "Both of us. We can take Thomas." He smiled. "Next Saturday," he said. "Next Saturday," she agreed. They sat in the evening quiet, and the cottonwoods shook their dry yellow leaves down to the creek water, and somewhere in the far pasture, one of the cattle called out and was answered, and the smell of the valley, sage and hay, and that particular mineral sweetness of the high desert autumn came to them on the breeze. "Etta," he said. "Abel," she said. "I think this is the best thing I have ever built," he said, not looking at her but at the valley, at the garden and the fence and the land and the life spread out before them. She took his hand. "We built it," she said. He turned to look at her then fully, with those dark eyes that she knew now as well as she knew the back of her own hand, with everything in them that was not controlled or reserved or methodical but simply felt, as plain and true as the cedar posts in the ground. "We built it," he agreed. Thomas stirred in his cradle and made a small sound of contentment and went still again. The stars were coming out above the valley, one by one, the way they did every clear evening, and the fence line at the edge of the garden glowed faintly in the last light, wrapped in dried lavender and the ghosts of summer roses. And Etta Watkins leaned her head on her husband's shoulder and looked at all of it and knew, with the certainty of someone who has walked through grief and loneliness and hard work, and arrived at something built from all of those things and more, that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. The following spring she planted a new section of lavender along the full length of the fence. Abel helped her carry the starts, handing them over the wire one by one, and they worked side by side in the April morning, while Thomas sat on a blanket at the edge of the garden and pulled experimentally at the new grass, and the smell of fresh-turned earth came up around them like a promise. The lavender would come through the fence, as it always did. It always had and it always would, spilling across the line between their two properties as if the boundary did not matter, as if the line was not an ending but a place where things began. And in the end, that was exactly what it was. 2 years after Thomas was born, in the spring of 1882, Etta found she was expecting again. She told Abel in the garden matter-of-factly, while she was thinning the bean seedlings, and he went very still in the way that meant he was feeling something large and was organizing himself around it. Then he stepped over the row of seedlings and held her for a long time, right there in the middle of the garden, his chin on top of her head, her hands against his chest, and she felt his heart going at the same quick pace it had gone the first time, steady and fast and full. "October," she said. "An autumn baby," he said. "Something different," she said. He laughed into her hair. Thomas arrived at the garden gate at that moment, having escaped from the blanket by the cottonwood with the determination of a 2-year-old who had no interest in boundaries, and stood in the garden path looking at his parents embracing with an expression of thoughtful assessment. "Come here," Abel said, and scooped him up, and Thomas submitted to this with the resigned air of someone who knows when he is outnumbered. Etta looked at the two of them, her husband with their son on his hip, both of them looking at her with the same dark eyes and the same level steady gaze, and she felt the future in that moment like something vast and good and hers. The October baby was a girl, and they named her Clara after Abel's mother, a choice that made him stand by the window for a long moment when she suggested it, looking out at the valley in the autumn gold, and when he turned back his eyes were bright. Clara was nothing like Thomas. She was loud and curious, and had her mother's dark red hair and her father's jaw and her grandmother's name, and she came into the world with a cry that carried to the pasture and made the cattle lift their heads. Abel held her for the first time with the same careful precision he brought to everything, and she gripped his finger immediately with an authority that made him look up at Etta with an expression of pure delight. "She has opinions," he said. "She is definitely mine," Etta said. Thomas, who was sitting in the corner of the room with Maria Garza's watchful eye on him, examined his sister with the focused analytical attention that was already his characteristic mode of engaging with new things, and then offered his considered verdict. "Small. She will not be small for long," Abel told him. He was right. The valley changed in small ways over the years, as valleys do. Reuben Garza became a permanent part of the Watkins operation, a young man of real skill and loyalty, who eventually built his own small house on the north end of the property, and whose presence allowed Abel to spend more time at the house in the evenings instead of working until dark. A second family came to the valley, the Clarks, who bought the old Henderson land on the North Ridge and turned out to be good neighbors. The road to Mesilla improved when the county finally graded it properly, which made the market trip a full-day journey instead of an overnight. Etta's garden became something people came to see. A woman from Mesilla who wrote for the territorial newspaper came out in the summer of 1883 and wrote a small article about the herb operation, calling it one of the finest examples of cultivated kitchen and medicinal gardening in the territory. And Etta read the article at the kitchen table while Abel read over her shoulder, and Thomas tried to climb the chair, and Clara, 8 months old and opinionated as ever, expressed something urgent from the cradle by the window. "Finest examples," Abel read aloud. "She was kind," Etta said. "She was accurate," he said. "The fence between the two original properties was still there. Technically speaking, it now divided the garden from the south pasture of what was, in law and in practice, a single operation, but neither of them had ever suggested taking it down. The lavender had colonized its full length on both sides, and the roses Etta had trained up the posts at the east end had spread and thickened into something that flowered every June with a determination that impressed even Abel, who had long since stopped being surprised by what his wife's garden was capable of. He still walked the fence line sometimes, on his evening round of the property. He had walked that line since he was old enough to walk it with his father, and he did not intend to stop. It was the line of the land, the measure of the thing they had been given to care for, and he walked it as a matter of respect. Sometimes Etta was in the garden when he made that round, and they would talk across the wire the way they had in the very beginning, except that now the words between them were comfortable and full, and loaded with the particular richness of two people who have spent years learning each other and are still learning. "The rose is going to need tying back," he said, one June evening, pausing at the east end of the fence. "I know it," she said from her knees in the garlic bed. "I was going to do it tomorrow. I can help." "You do not like the roses," she said. "The thorns." "I do not dislike the roses," he said. "I dislike the thorns. Those are different things." She sat back on her heels and looked at him across the fence. This man she had been married to for 4 years. this careful, precise, endlessly decent man who had built his fence exactly on the property line, and then offered to move it, and had held her through every hard winter and every abundant summer, and had named their son after her first husband, and had stood at the window with bright eyes when she named their daughter after his mother. "Come through the gate," she said. "I will show you how to tie it back without getting scratched." He came through the gate. She showed him. He was a quick learner when he wanted to be. Clara's first word was a point of some debate in the Watkins household, with Thomas insisting it was his name, which it clearly wasn't, and Abel reporting that it sounded to him like more, said in the context of supper, and Etta maintaining that it was dirt, said in the context of the garden, which Thomas found embarrassing for reasons he could not entirely articulate, and Abel found both plausible and amusing. Clara, who would grow up to have her mother's way with growing things and her father's way with precision, began following Etta into the garden at 18 months, padding through the beds with her boots leaving small prints in the soft earth, and would sit by the fence post and pull at the lavender stems and smell her hands, a look of perfect satisfaction on her face. Abel watched her do this one morning from the pasture side of the fence, his elbows on the top wire, and said to Etta, who was planting the spring garlic, "She is going to be in this garden her whole life." "Good," Etta said, pressing a clove into the earth. "Yes," he said, "good." Thomas, at 4, was more interested in the cattle operation, following Abel and Reuben on their morning rounds with the serious intentionality of someone in training for a profession, asking questions with a frequency that Reuben described, not unkindly, as relentless. He could identify each cow by name by the time he was 3.5, and Abel had made him a small pair of work gloves that he wore with an importance that his mother found charming. The valley in those years was a good place to raise children. The land was generous when you worked it. The neighbors were decent people. The sky was enormous and the seasons were clear, and the work, though hard, was work that produced visible results, a thing that Etta had always valued and that her children were learning to value too. In the spring of 1884, Etta planted the full south fence line with a new variety of lavender she had obtained through a contact in Santa Fe, a broader leaf type that flowered longer and smelled different from what she had, deeper and darker, and she planted it on both sides of the fence without quite deciding to, reaching through the wire to plant on Abel's side in the same motion as planting on her own, as if the fence were not a division at all. Abel came to the fence the next morning and looked at the new plants. "Both sides again," he said. "It seemed right," she said. "It always does," he said. He was smiling. He smiled more now, easily and frequently, and she still felt it each time like something warm, like summer staying past its welcome, like the best thing in the best season of the best year. She handed him a lavender start through the fence wire. "Plant it down at the corner," she said, "where you can smell it from the barn." He took it from her, careful as always. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And he walked down the fence line in the spring morning with the lavender start in his hands, and the valley opened out around him, gold and green and alive with the particular brilliance of an April day when everything is beginning. And Etta watched him go and picked up her trowel and put her hands back in the earth. From across the yard, she could hear Thomas telling Clara something at great length and authority, and Clara responding with the kind of succinct refusal that suggested she had opinions about it, and the cattle in the south pasture moving in their slow morning way, and Abel's boots in the dry grass along the fence line, and all of it was woven together into a sound that was not silence and not noise, but the sound of a life in full, vibrant, improbable, hard-won occupation. She pressed a clove of garlic into the earth. She pressed another. And above the valley the spring sky went on, blue and endless and vast, the kind of sky that had drawn people to this country for as long as people had been drawn anywhere, the kind of sky that made you feel both very small and very much a part of something that mattered. And below it the fence ran its straight cedar line along the property boundary, wrapped in lavender and roses, and the climbing testimony of 6 years of springs, each one more abundant than the last. Abel reached the corner post and crouched down and dug a small hole with his fingers, the same fingers that had sunk the first post of that fence into the hard red earth on a March morning 6 years ago, when the woman next door had come to her porch and called him deeply irritating, and he planted the lavender start with the same careful deliberateness he brought to every act of his life, pressed the earth back around it, and stood up. He looked back at the length of the fence, at his wife bent over her beds in the morning light, at the house with the sound of children in it, at the valley they had made into something together, and he felt the fullness of it settle into him like the certainty he had always needed, and had always, in the end, found in the things he built well. He picked up his hat from where he had set it on the post. He put it on. He walked back up the fence line toward his wife and his morning and his life. The lavender grew.